Hi, everyone. I know you guys have been now through a lot today, so we're going to try and keep this as fun and engaging as we can, and we've got a great panel for that. I think if any of you know them, they're going to be giving you, I think, a lot of insight and also being a lot of fun. So, I mean, one of the things when it comes to journalists, national security, there was a reason when the Pegasus case started out. We were all there was a lot of excitement. I think a lot of us were a bit wary, but there was a lot of excitement, especially when the order setting up the committee expressly said, oh, you know what, you can't keep using national security as an excuse all the time, and you have to, if you're going to make that argument, you have to justify it. So there was thought, okay, is the Supreme Court actually going to be asking the government to justify its usage of, oh my God, we've got national security issues as a thing? Now, as everyone knows, by the end of that case, that just evaporated, and the government didn't cooperate, and pretty much nothing happened to them. They were not asked to justify their attempts to use national security as a get-out-of-jail card. Now, the situation with this and journalists has long been tied to a lot of things. Traditionally, there was the idea that the OSA, which was the Official Secrets Act, that could be something which would be used. One of my colleagues faced a case under that, where national security was being used as the ground to say, oh, you can't even report on something. During the Rafale case, there was an attempt to try and get a case against NRAM for his reporting on the Rafale thing, saying that, oh, he was using documents which were stolen, which was quite remarkable because, I mean, it was literally just leaked, and that was, however, considered stolen. Now, that's, of course, just one facet of it, and we've got and as you said, this is an amazing panel to actually take you through more of the kind of ways in which national security laws have found themselves being used to target journalists for, really just doing their job. This is not about some person who's actually a spy, who's trying to put together things and doing stuff. It's about journalists doing their jobs and facing those problems. The Siddique Kappan case has been discussed at the previous session a bit here. And there's a lot of elements of that which are important to our session, and we'll be touching on those as we go along. We're going to open with, Hartosh is going to take us through some examples of the kind of intimidation which he's seen personally with his journalists, with his colleagues, with himself as well, and the way in which these national security laws, and very importantly, the language of national security, and the sort of, the kind of specter it invokes, is something which is used to make the case against a journalist stronger. We all know what's at play. They want to shut a journalist up. They don't like what they're saying. But how making this an issue of national security becomes so much more difficult for the journalists and so much more threatening. Hartosh.
So actually, I've been here all day, not for the session. I was here downstairs for something on Blue Star. And one of the things I remarked was that everybody there was above the age of 50, and there are many people who are below the age of 50 here, but that connect is important. Why am I raising that? Because people tend to think that what we are encountering is new, it hasn't happened before. National security. There was a time during the Punjab operations that newspapers being published out of Chandigarh had to go through a government censor. Portions were deleted, portions were cleared, sections of the newspapers were printed. The same excuse of national security was invoked then. And what lay behind it? What lay behind it was, again, a centralized authority, and Indira Gandhi, we have a Narendra Modi today, the kind of government in power, then the kind of government in power now. These are the parallels. This is the condition under which national security is invoked. The laws are actually secondary to the political atmosphere that exists. The laws are just a manifestation of this. The reality is that all this stems from the kind of politics we find ourselves under. And I mean, we've encountered that at Caravan quite often enough. I mean, the most recent, which is a case actually Vrinda was dealing with, was two of them. Most recently in Kashmir, one of our journalists, Shahid Dantare, actually reported on how the army was organizing its own protests. We have photographs of the people getting down from army trucks, the army men helping them take down protest banners, actually. So the army's, these sort of tame protests which will strengthen the Indian state's case. So when you cannot find any other reason to file a case, because everybody there has been quoted, everybody has been ascribed to all journalistic work done, what do? They say that the people who have been named claim that they are now under threat from militants because they've been named in the story. Shahid's father is summoned to the police thana. There is no law under which they can do that. Tell your son to behave. If he doesn't behave, tell your son to come here. Shahid is summoned, that inquiry is still going on. Is there a law under which this inquiry is going on? Is there an FIR? Is there a complaint? Is there a hearing? We are still unclear, but that inquiry is underway. The kind of pressure that puts on every journalist who will report from Kashmir is quite evident, basically. In the case of the farm protests, on the day the farm protests entered here, Navreet Singh died. We had eyewitnesses who told us that he had been shot at. This was reported with the names of the eyewitness. For reporting this and contradicting the official version, sedition cases have been filed against my colleague, the editor Vinod Jose, and the owners of Caravan. That sedition case is still proceeding. It's part of what has happened. During the Delhi riots, and I mean the Delhi riots are a particularly bad example because, I mean, I know cases are proceeding in court today, but what has happened on the ground is that when your entire executive is compromised, I mean, the entire basis of prosecution itself is flawed. The Delhi police itself is behaving in a manner that cannot be justified. And again, I go back to history. If we had actually looked at 1984 and police conduct at that time and actually taken action, none of this would happen today. But our reporters who were on the spot, who were reporting, were beaten up by a right-wing mob. At the same time, one of our reporters went to a police station where he was beaten up by the ACP. These are all cases that are proceeding. No action is being taken. This is all in the past 1 year. This kind of sustained attack on journalists. And we have barely a handful of 10 or 12 reporters on the field, of which 5 or 6 are facing these kind of threats. And I'm just pointing out the most recent ones. Just means that in reality, to do the job of journalism has been more difficult today than it has ever been at any point of time in our history, basically. And national security is obviously the pretext. There is a danger, we are anti-national, we are doing seditious things, etc.
So I think that's just a very brief question, like, because you said this is something which you're seeing which is unprecedented. In the past, when there were attempts to harass journalists or there were attempts to bring cases against them, was it with this national security narrative around it? Because that obviously changes even for the public. You know, it's going to be much more difficult to drum up support for a journalist if they're being accused of a national security offense. So do you feel that there's been an increase in that language? Or, you know, given there have been examples, as you said, from the past, was the way in which the intimidation of journalists done there different? For instance, say, whether it was the Punjab cases or the...
Well, look, so what we've seen, and I think it is, people are saying this quite correctly, we are seeing the Kashmirization of the rest of the country. In Kashmir, this was already common practice. What happened in Zubair's case, and Pratik was here just, is that you are out on one case, 5 other cases are filed. In Kashmir, people have been behind bars for almost a decade where there is no case has been upheld. You are out, another case, nothing is ever sustained. Yeah? Take Siddiq Kapoor's case. He gets bail, there is a PMLA case that is haunting. So we've seen suddenly the national security discourse taken from the borders where we were all content. A lot of the country was quite okay with what was happening in Kashmir as long as it was happening. In Kashmir now it has come home to everybody here and the same procedures are being used. The second thing that has been used is I think Rebecca had mentioned it, that at one point of time, journalists were considered immune from government sort of pressures. What this government has done is weaponize journalism against journalism. That is, prime time is devoted to castigating the few journalists who are doing their jobs. So already the position of the journalist and faith in journalism is weakened. And then at the back of that, if you put in the case of national security, then the public outrage is not at the government, but it is at the journalist who's actually writing the truth in some sense.
So I think this gives us a good opportunity now to go to Vrinda to talk about the ways in which these kind of laws are being used in this manner. Now, one, it'll be helpful, you know, if you can just take, I think there's obviously been a bit of a discussion, you know, we've talked about UAP a little bit, but, you know, maybe a little bit about the NSA and the PSA, you know, in Kashmir, since I think both of you had really wanted to kind of get into that aspect of how Kashmir, we've been seeing this stuff and it's now becoming more and more used elsewhere. So how is it that what are the ways, because, I mean, it's one thing to say, okay, fine, it's just that, you know, the law is being misused. But are there aspects to these laws which are creating grounds for impunity in themselves? So it's not just about having a bad actor in the executive or the police, but the way the law is framed itself is almost invites abuse. So one, if you could take us through something about that, some of the examples which you've seen in particular where you've seen this work and, you know, issues which journalism facing in Kashmir, say, you know, not just the Caravan journalists, there's even Fahad Shah who's faced a lot of that. And this whole way in which the law is being used to create that impunity, how does that work structurally? Like, and is that something which we really need to start asking ourselves, that we need to, improve the way our laws are being drafted?
Thanks, Vakasha. Just a couple of big ticket things I want to flag before I respond specifically to this. For us to just keep in mind, given what we are discussing here, and I suppose has been part of the conversation since morning, I think we need to also find vocabulary, and I think this is a task we are going to give to the journalists and particularly Newslaundry people. We need to find language which communicates national security is state-sponsored language. It's a language that we have adopted without any critique. So we need to find phrases that communicate people's security, because national security does not mean our security. Otherwise, the budget would look very different in the country. So let's find language to express our views. Anti-national, a phrase that we hear very often now, not just on television, on Twitter, etc., but it has entered judgments. And it does not enter, this kind of language entering judgments and legal discourse, legal arguments, to my mind, is extremely dangerous. And we need to put a halt to it, because before you know, there could well be an offense saying anti-national. And so and I'm not joking, we know that there is an entire process underway with the Ministry of Home Affairs to have an overhaul of criminal laws, including the Indian Penal Code, Evidence Act, etc. So don't be surprised by what may come our way. Which brings me to the question that Vakasha asked about, how do we look at this, and which Hartosh referred to. So for very long, when we spoke about Kashmir, or prior to that, much more attention was paid to the Northeast, where AFSPA, etc., was there, and we used to talk of it as a state of exception, and using the Italian philosopher Gambon's juridical definition that he gave. Where is that state of exception today, and what is the exception today? And has that in any way petered into what is happening all over? And what do we need to, I think very rightly Hartosh pointed out, some of us have been around for a little longer. Do we need to revisit what was it that we didn't pay sufficient attention to? And are those processes, those practices today, have they been mainstreamed all over, including in laws, legal processes, and actions, particularly of the state and law enforcement agencies? Let us take a quick example. Vakasha mentioned the Pegasus matter, and the Chief Justice of that time, Chief Justice of India, Justice Ramanna, said that I have said so in Anuradha Bhasin judgment, which we know was about the internet shutdown, that national security is not a free pass that will be given to the state, and it will be subject to judicial review. It's important to recall that the state actually argued, and since I was representing Anuradha Bhasin, and on the aspect of freedom of press and internet shutdown, we were making a connect. The state actually argued that this is a national security matter and therefore will not be subject to judicial review. That was a huge push the state tried to make. The court blocked it and said, no, these orders of suspension of internet, 144 orders will be subject to judicial review, and national security will not give you a free pass. And that was the argument on which the Pegasus Committee was set up. We were asked as citizens to go ahead and give our devices, which many citizens did. The state, according to the court, refused to cooperate. Please understand what is happening today. You have a state that is constantly undermining, if not subverting, the rule of law. Who is trying to keep the rule of law alive? It is the citizen who has been burdened with that. The state no longer wants the rule of law to be in practice. If the state does not cooperate, what kind of adverse inference is to be drawn? What legal consequences must follow? Those are all questions that have been left open because the report has been sealed. Hopefully at some point there will be legal exhumation of that report and the story will move forward. In Kashmir, for instance, I don't know how many of you are familiar with this. There is, of course, the Public Safety Act forever and ever. What do these laws, to respond to the question that inherent in these laws, preventive detention laws, which as many of you who come from the field of law would be familiar, there is a discordant note. In fact, the words used in the Constituent Assembly are, this is a jarring note. In Article 22 of the Constitution, where very, very important legal rights that you will be produced before a magistrate within 24 hours. You'll have a right to have a lawyer of your choice to represent you. You will be informed of your grounds of arrest. And right there comes preventive detention, saying that if you are arrested under preventive detention, then these rights will not apply. So from the time of the founding of the Indian Constitution, there was a heightened attention paid to issues of national security and state given that power for preventive detention purposes. It's my understanding that that kind of attention to state having certain extraordinary powers over all civil liberties actually has an underlying presumption. The presumption being that the state will act in good faith. The state will exercise this power only where required for quote-unquote national security purposes. Everybody here can think for themselves, how is that power being exercised? I'll give just 3 quick examples. Mia Qayyum, president of the Srinagar Bar Association, was arrested, as were many others, when the abrogation of Article 370 takes place. And in the High Court judgment, which actually makes fascinating reading, he was placed under Public Safety Act. And in the High Court judgment, the court says his ideology is like a live volcano. And therefore, it can never go stale because he has this different ideology. And therefore, how can you say that now he will not act in this manner? He can always continue to act in this manner, and maybe he should consider whether he'll make a statement, etc., giving that up. The matter came to the Supreme Court. Mr. Dushyant Dave and I represented Mia Qayyum, and similar questions were raised, and of course we said our client is not going to make any declaration about his ideology. Then you have and we know that under Public Safety Act, without trial, without charge, you can be there for 2 years. You have Asif Sultan, journalist in Kashmir, I think arrested since 2018, if I'm not mistaken. What did he write about? He wrote about overground workers. Hartosh knows as journalists, they need to write about a whole manner of things. What the state describes as overground workers. So he wrote about some militants and how increasingly young people are attracted towards militancy, post Burhan Wani. Now, if you're going to write about that, who are you going to communicate with? Who are the people you're going to talk to? Who are going to be your contacts? So they say, oh, you were in touch with overground workers of militancy. His digital devices have been taken, and perhaps there was some discussion on digital devices in the earlier session. And of course, nothing has yet been put in court. There's no charge. Charges have not been framed. And of course, what is a digital device of a journalist going to hold? All the contacts. Then you have Fahad Shah. 2011, an article was written. He's the editor of a news portal called Kashmir Wala. Somebody else wrote the article. Yes, as a publisher, he has a legal liability, undoubtedly. And he is now under PSA and UAPA. UAPA, which says advocates, advises, abets. Section 13 and Section 18. I don't know what we are advocating here, but that's how broad it is. And no, it's not, this government, yes, did make some amendments of individual terrorists, etc., in the UAPA, but many of these, as Hartosh has pointed out, have actually a long legacy. This did not begin today. The state has been functioning in a certain manner. Today, it is not the a process is the punishment is a phrase we use very casually now. I actually don't agree with that anymore. I think we've gone past that stage. It's not the weaponization of law. The law is the weapon. Law is no longer enabling. Show me any sphere of life where law is the enabling tool that we had. I fortunately, and as did Hartosh, we grew up at a time where law was used to enable, encourage, enjoy, expand rights. Today, law is not playing that part anymore.
I mean, I know that we've got some young students here from law schools and from journalism schools as well. Unfortunately, this is what the truth is. I mean, when I went to law school, we were probably wrong, I think, but we were still, this is what, 2008 to 2013. And I think at that time, we still were thinking, this is, as you said, it's this enabling thing. It's the courts are going to actually achieve that. And I think the sad truth is that that's really not been happening. Now, one of the things which came up a little bit during the last session was the issue of the PMLA and this new way in which financial instruments are being used. One of the interesting points, which I think Abhinandan had asked, that what was the actual origin? One of the funny things is the origin of the PMLA wasn't even for terrorism, wasn't even for any of those things. It was for drug money, because it came out all those discussions from the 80s and then the 90s, and it was in 1999 that India started drafting the legislation. So this is pre, your 9/11 and everything. And during the time when they came up with it, the statements of objects and reasons only talks about drug offenses and why it needs to be used to tackle that. And of course, now it's just become this absolute catch-all for everything. But what I want to ask Hartosh is, what we're seeing now is, whether it's PMLA, whether it's now IT rules, the new IT rules, there's all these new ways in which you are seeing these laws, which aren't even actually about national security, are being used to now come after journalists. The language still is a national security couch language. So when they went for the PMLA case, they said, you know what? The reason why this is so important is money laundering is as bad as terrorism. It affects the economic status of the country. And now this kind of language, you tie that in, plus then the cases. What is the effect this is having on journalists? Because they want to do their job, and obviously most of them want to be able to do it fearlessly, don't want to get intimidated. But it's a real risk, right? I mean, it is, we saw with Zubair's case, we're seeing with this. So how is that affecting journalists and their ability to pick up stories? Are they self-censoring more? How are you dealing with that in your newsroom, for instance?
Two things. I think Vrinda used the term that the law is a weapon. So for me, actually speaking, the discussion of individual laws is a totally pointless exercise. The state will always have, for whatever reasons, exceptional circumstances, exceptional places, laws which are drafted to deal with certain kind of crimes. When the intent of the state changes, when the intent is to make this a weapon, those laws will be drafted in very ordinary circumstances. So today you will change the writing of the PMLA, tomorrow of the UAPA, it doesn't matter. There will be 5 other laws which will be invoked, and we will eventually reach the state which what our lawyers said in case of Kashmir when we were asking what is our threat to our journalist, he said, "Ab law ki baat mat kariye." The law doesn't exist. Let's not pretend that the law exists. Yeah, we will eventually be.
Statement from Impolite Conversations. Yeah, the law doesn't exist.
Law ki baat mat karo. Nothing functions according to the law. We can discuss all we want. That is a pretense, and we are not very far from that situation often enough. As Vrinda is saying, lawyers, the legal process is now a means of defensive last resort. It is not an expansion of rights. It is not an expansion of. So what does the impact of this in terms of journalism? Well, most of the impact has already happened. It's already around us. Journalists don't do their work because they can't do their work. Journalism mostly doesn't exist. What does exist is what you call media here. I have a great objection to this term media, because it is the commercialization of journalism. It doesn't actually carry the intent of journalism with it. There's very little journalism that is being done. In the places where it is being done, we are aware of the risks we are running. So there is no change. As long as we have the means to do it, we will continue doing it. What they are trying to do, apart from the individual threat, What they are trying to do is the institutional threat, because individuals, to shut down individuals, which is why I think there is too much problem in emphasizing individual journalists, individual Twitter handles, etc. That doesn't matter. Individuals can be very easily shut down. They are now trying to institutionally squeeze the money that is flowing in. What happened with the Zubair's case? They wanted to open up what funding alt news got. What is happening with the use of PMLA? What happens with the raids on CPR? The raid on the IPSMF. It has nothing to do with foreign funding. It has nothing to do with anything. It is funded by the 3 top industrialists in this country, which are cozy with the government in the first place. You are not looking at their funding there. You are looking at the funding when they are giving chicken. I mean, really, I don't want to use. They are giving peanuts, peanuts to small organizations who are doing some journalism. Why are you looking at it? So, when the intent is such, where we are in the situation where the law doesn't matter, we have to work under those premises. Till it is possible, we will do our work. And when it becomes impossible, well, then there's nothing to be done in any case. But we haven't got there yet.
Do you think that's, I mean, very brief, do you think that that's, how long do you, I mean, do you see that coming though? Like, I mean, because the screws are tightening. Do you see that, or do you still have hope?
I mean, this is a very perverse argument that I'm going to give you. But my understanding of there was recently a discussion, was asked to take part in, will there be a genocide of this country? And I said, I don't want to participate because I don't think that's the intent of this government. Why? It wants a slow squeeze. It lives off the threat of the other. It also survives under the facade of processes. It wants to project we are a democratic constitutional country. It wants to boast of the fact that we are still in possession of a free media, that we are part of this larger democratic enterprise. So in some senses, I sometimes feel that we exist and organizations like us exist
we're
for them to point to the rest of the world that, oh, look, these guys are doing their job. After all, we have a free media. So I don't think you will see a complete freeze. You will just see tightening, signals, never a complete erasure. So I think in that space, there's space for us to do our job. Will that job be effective is another question altogether.
So, I mean, given that, I think one of the key things both of you have talked about here is a need to also accept and understand what the reality of the situation is. Stop trying to go like the old route, which we say, oh, we'll talk about this measure being taken is illegal. It goes against X judgment. That's not what's relevant anymore in a sense. But practically speaking, we have journalists trying to do their jobs. We want them to be able to do their jobs well while having to negotiate with security laws. What are the things which we can talk about which journalists can do? What are the things they can rely on? What are the legal strategies they can rely on? And what are the things we need to start demanding from the court? So this is a 2-part question for each of you. For Vrinda, I want to ask, and we briefly discussed this before about the question of, do journalists have some sort of special protections which they can rely on? Is that even a fair thing to say? Is that something we can really think about? Is that something they can try to use when it comes to the case against them? And then to Hartosh, I'm going to ask you, once we've heard from Vrinda, I want to ask you about something which both of you have talked about, which is the fact that, we've seen this previous usage of languages of exception. We've seen this previous usage of allowing this stuff to happen. So what are the kind of changes we need to bring about in our language and things which, again, Vrinda had spoken about? So what are some of the ways in which we can stop falling prey to this? So to start with Vrinda, are there any special protections or any kind of special procedures or something that journalists can use to be like, you know what, the way freedom of the press is this concept everyone talks about, is it something which we can actually use in the courts?
See, we should infer. And before everybody thinks that Hartosh and I are advocating that we are in doomsday, I don't think either of us are. So if we are sending that signal, we are bad communicators, but that's not what we do. If we've done this so long and we are not trying to tell you to give up at all. Actually, it's just that one needs to recognize what is here, and you develop new tools, and each generation actually develops better and sharper and newer tools. So it's not to say there's nothing to be done. There's lots to be done in the court, and there's huge amount of work to be done by journalists, whether they are, in whichever way they are configured, whether as individual, independent, or with portals or magazines or whatever. So there is a lot to be done, and no, the government it's not as though the state has silenced everybody, we wouldn't be here. And it hasn't silenced us because we have refused to be silenced, not that the state is benign. The state is never benign. the state actually has to, as he said, it's very interesting. If you go to the UN, there is this universal periodic review process that happens. It's going to happen again in November. And it's fascinating to hear. Usually, I don't know who's going to represent and lead the government of India this time. In the past, it's been the Attorney General. If I'm not mistaken, Mr. Vanavati went twice, and perhaps Mr. Rohtagi was the Attorney General in the last occasion, if I recall correctly. And what is the shield and the sword that the court uses there in the international fora? Constitution, Chapter 3, Supreme Court, all the judgments in which lawyers like me would be called all manner of names, applauding our work, would all be the ones they will cite there. So Hartosh is absolutely right. This, to stay the largest democracy, that Chapter 3 is what they hang on to, and then functional, vibrant court legal system, and of course, whenever in doubt, Mahatma Gandhi. So that's what they hold on to save themselves in the international domain. Coming to the question that you asked about,
practically speaking, what are the things journalists can...
So whether they have any special protections, actually if you infer from various judgments, whether they are bail orders, even the Pegasus order, which actually talks about journalistic sources, because as we know, top editors and others went to court in the Pegasus matter, if I'm not mistaken, and Ram is one of the petitioners, and the court notes that if this kind of malware, state surveillance, state snooping is going to take place, journalists will not be able to do their work. So it actually notes that they have a special role to play. If you look at judgments giving bail, Arnab Goswami, Amish Devgan, Siddiq Kapan has just caught, Zubair, I think there is an underlying understanding of the targeting is happening because they are journalists. And therefore, while everybody should have a right to bail, it's not as though they have an extraordinary right to bail. It's not written anywhere, either in the law or a judgment. But there is that you can't be going after people whose job it is. All of them are not necessarily calling out those in power, but whose job it is to call out those in power and ask the inconvenient questions. If you go back to the earlier emergency era judgments of Sakal Papers, Indian Express, where the state tried to control the production through, how many pages to be circulated, import duty, etc. Again, the court gave a certain amount of leeway and said, no, state control will not be allowed. Coming back to Anuradha Bhasin, where is internet recognized as a fundamental right, where it connects with your freedom of speech and expression and right to practice your profession or trade? So I think you can read into certain judgments that there is an understanding, a judicial appreciation that journalists do need, their liberties need to be protected in certain ways.
I think that's something which, also there are, this is we've seen the courts kind of do this. At the same time, there is also the fact that, it sometimes takes a very long time before that sort of safeguard kicks in. Hartosh, one thing which I wanted to ask you about this again, since we're talking now, we're trying to talk about how do you make the best of the situation. Both of you have talked about the fact that, when there was this stuff happening in Kashmir, now we have the Kashmirization. When it was happening in Kashmir for a very long time, we didn't see enough condemnation. There were people who were doing it, but was there enough? Was the language which had to be used when talking about these things, should that have been different? And today, I once tried to make this argument in the aftermath of the Navreet Singh death, that should we now at this point start saying that the way we look at, when journalists are reporting on these cases, we try to do it with, as we've talked about earlier, that this is a case in good faith, and then we point, okay, this is wrong, this is what an expert is saying. Should we implicitly start from the assumption that this is going to be a misuse of the law? Should our language start to reflect these kind of things in these cases so that we prevent the language of national security, the state-sponsored language of national security, allowing itself to become embedded in our own language unwittingly?
Look, if you really ask me, this is a much larger question. Are power to resist or power to act is decided by the circumstances we find ourselves in. The way that our current circumstances connect up with Kashmir also has to do with a larger problem that we as journalists or the country has never faced before. It is simply this, that journalism in a constitutional democracy is predicated on the idea of the existence of a public that reads our reporting, then dispassionately examines the reporting and then says, yeah, the government is doing something wrong here, we must raise our voices, we must protest, and then the institutions act accordingly. We are in the situation today that there is no public. We are in the situation where the country is divided into, I don't know what the analogy would be. It is like everybody is a football fan, they won on a T-shirt, and most people are wearing the Team Modi T-shirt. And if you are writing against Team Modi, then you are writing against my team. I am not going to pay attention to you. It doesn't matter what the logic of the process is you follow. It doesn't matter how well you've done your job. It doesn't matter how well the story has been researched or written. It is not going to be plausible. When I compare this with Kashmir, this was the same thing. Under the guise of national security, the rest of the country was not willing to believe good average liberals that there was something wrong going on in Kashmir. Today, now the same good average liberal finds the rest of the country is not willing to believe them when they say there is something going wrong anywhere else in that country. So in these circumstances, this larger attitude permeates into institutions. At personal levels, people who are part of law enforcement, of the judiciary, etc., reflect this in their personal belief system. That it then seeps into the system, that it seeps into the judgments, into the language, it's very difficult to resist. So yeah, we have to make sure we don't fall prey to that. We have to keep doing our job. And in that sense, maybe I'm even bleaker than Vrinda. I'm not holding out much hope. The act of resistance is an act of resistance because you think that is the right thing to do, and you must also partially enjoy the act of resistance. Let me be honest here, because you should not be coerced or forced by some powers who are acting in that condition. So I think we are in it for the long haul. There's going to be a long time before things turn. But as Vrinda said, there is a space within which it is still possible to operate. But we must operate keeping in mind the limitations of what we are doing. It will not have, our journalism today will not have the same impact it had even 10 years ago. I know that for a fact. I was part of the team that did the Radia tapes. I was part of the team that did the Judge Loya case. I know the different public responses to both those stories. When we did the Radia tapes, it hit the government badly, but nobody was pointing around and telling us, why are you doing those stories? What is your motive? You are anti-national. In 5 years, the very idea of public that must respond to, that drives a democracy, has been changed and manipulated to the point where you cannot expect the same kind of responses. And that is a problem that cannot be solved within the domains that we are talking about. We must recognize that. That doesn't stop us from doing what we are doing.
So I think there are some things, hopefully, as journalists, we're going to be able to come up with that kind of language. There are some demands maybe we can make from the courts. One of the things we've talked about, and there's some brief attempts, is, because we know the executive is not going to, neither the parliament nor the government are going to pass rules or laws for bringing more accountability or doing anything better. Can we see, would there be any benefit to trying to say, make requests for accountability through the courts for when these cases are filed, right? Because these cases are filed, people are stuck in jail, they eventually get out. We heard a little bit earlier about how, for instance, malicious prosecution can only file after there's an actual acquittal. Is there any scope, you think, for trying to get the courts to order, whether it's compensation, whether it's disciplinary action, rather than leave it up to the executive to do it, which will obviously never happen? So is there any benefit, you think, to that, or is that a non-starter, really? Trying to get the courts to maybe try to bring in, this is one brief thing which we can do, is ask them, make them accountable. Any real scope for making that happen?
Okay, so we don't make demands on the court. At least lawyers don't. That would be a strange thing to do. They're not my bosses that I'm going to make demands to them. Of course we have. And see, look at the legal history of this country. It's very rich. And Vakasha is not that old. He needs to read legal history differently. How did all these rights come? The executive never gave us any rights. Let's get rid of these silly illusions about Parliament giving us rights. Even the 2013 Act was not given to women. People marched on the streets and got it out of the government. And that's how rights have always been got. And there are, we saw that the phase of emergency where the Supreme Court failed its people and did not uphold the constitution that it has sworn to. And then, of course, after far too long, it reckoned with its mistakes. It's just that I don't think institutions can be allowed to apologize periodically. I think there's something wrong with that. So, yes, this whole engagement and advancements of rights has happened through inside the court with people's struggles and social justice movements. And that's how the system of democracy works. Whether it is, I have my friend Shamona sitting here, who's a lawyer. She works on tribal rights, forest rights. How did those laws happen? Those kind of changes in law have happened through social justice movements, courts being compelled to comprehend them. Neither the executive nor the courts can be expected to be these enlightened people who are going to give anything. The fact that today malicious prosecution is an issue that is being repeatedly raised in many forums. I remember addressing in NLUD about 5 years ago the issue of malicious prosecution where a Supreme Court judge of Sri Lanka was sitting. So these are new ideas that come into the legal domain, and through judgments, through litigation, we actually advance ideas. And there is back and forth. There's no period, there's no golden age where everything was perfect. In the court, at least, it never is. And you will have some judgments which will be, to some of us, may seem like they are not in keeping with the constitutional letter and spirit. So the court is the space of advancing rights, litigating, constantly raising new ideas. Accountability of the state is, to my mind, the key to everything. It's the key to, Hartosh referred to earlier parts of 84, etc. The issue of mass crimes, the issue of accountability of state, for many of us living in Delhi, started with 1984. What are the key questions we raised then, which we are raising till date? We didn't spring to life in 2002. Our accountability of the state. This government says they want to decolonize the laws. Excellent. Pick up the Indian Penal Code. Please see which is the shortest chapter in the Indian Penal Code. Crimes by state. What is happening around you? Why are the public servants, those in state executive, those in state power, not being held accountable? Let's change the Indian Penal Code. But to what extent? Create accountability of the state. Creating accountability of state actors is the key to a democracy. And that is where we need to push our litigation.
Thank you, guys. That was, we've also, I think, kind of overrun time already. I do still want to see if we can just quickly grab 3 questions from the audience. So I'm sorry that this has gone on so late. So we have, so let me try and get 3 questions. We go 2, 3, 4. Okay, all right. So why don't we get the young man there in the back with the spectacles to start.
Hi, thank you for the talk. You pointed at use of language in the courts. I really want to understand. I'm a law clerk at the Supreme Court. I want to...
Can you introduce yourself, please?
You want me to take my name?
Only your name.
Yash. And so I just finished a LLM thesis on constitutional morality. And in the last month of my work, there was an FCRA judgment which said that it undermines constitutional morality if the state is not able to fend for itself from sources within the country and needs to seek help from abroad. Now, my question to you is very, very specifically. You said, you're a lawyer, right? You say murder and someone else says murder. There's a difference. You look at the ingredients and everything else. Do courts today and people sitting in them understand when they use certain words what they really mean? I mean, this is coming into judgments now. What is constitutional morality? I mean, I think no one knows today what is it. there's a Solicitor General who says that a certain allegation against a social activist is more than murder. I mean, do we know what murder means anymore? Is the profession so weak? Is its history so poor that we've just allowed everyone to come in and hijack and give it a meaning against what it meant? You said they've turned the press against the press, they've turned the law against the law, and the lawyers against the lawyers. I mean, my question again is that...
Yash has been stuck in this thing where he couldn't say all of this for a while. Now he's like, I need to get this.
So just to cut it short...
We've had a brief chat about this also, Vrinda. You talked about the usage of language like anti-national. How do we get the courts to stop this, like this kind of language?
I hear you. See, this is a period in this country of contestation of ideas. It will happen in the courtroom also. To imagine that the court, which really still for many areas of our lives and of power, remains an arbiter for now. This contestation of ideas will not enter that domain. I would not imagine that. And in fact, I think this kind of this kind of blurting out, which we see in some judgments now, the FCRA being one example, in the Sakya Jafri judgment to say activists sitting in air-conditioned rooms. I mean, when did we last time hear a judgment talk like that?
Sitting in air-conditioned rooms.
Yeah, I didn't say that. And why is an air-conditioned room a problem? I've not understood. I mean, either we want to be Gandhian, we don't want to be Gandhian in our mode of economy. We need to figure that part out of life. So, this contestation of ideas will enter. And that contestation is actually very severe today. You have the Places of Religious Worship Act. If I'm not mistaken, the issue whether constitutional morality is part of the Constitution and preamble has actually been referred to a bench now, right? So all these phrases are up, everything is up for grabs as to what means what. That's why I'm saying language is key to law. The interpretation of language and words is going to be key to how we are going to think, how our freedoms are going to be described, and how power is going to be exercised. So this is going, I mean, as he said, it's also a very exciting phase to be a lawyer. So as he said, you actually have to enjoy the act of resistance. I don't feel that, oh my God, what is happening? I feel, yes, it's a challenge. Let's engage. It's also legally and intellectually extremely challenging.
I mean, maybe we need editors for like the judges' judgments also now at this point. So
no, I think they should tell us what they think.
Okay, so we have more questions. Okay, we got a lady in the back there. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Prerna. When we talk about nationalism and the legal part and journalism, I have seen two groups coming up. One group is where there is Muhammad Zubair, Siddiq Kappan, Fahad Shah, Rana Ayub to some extent. On the other hand, there is Arnab, Amish and Navika. So can we actually...
Almost avoided this discussion, but yeah, it's a good one.
Yeah, so like, can we divorce the conversation around, national security, journalism and identity, the kind of identity probably the state is trying to target? And another point I wanted to make when we talk about the legal language, the most scathing observations on the Nupur Sharma case were all oral. They did not make it into the order or the judgment. So when most of the things which need to be said are just, they're not making into the legal documents, like where do these stand then?
State is targeting by identity, undeniably. I mean, you have to be totally blind to not know that. Should rights be allocated on identity and liberty be allocated on identity by courts? Never. Should those comments on Nupur Sharma have entered the order? No. It has nothing to do with the court. Their judges are also going to react and respond, and they're going to say certain things. Should Nupur Sharma's cases have been consolidated? Yes. Why are we reacting on identity and ideology? We will have to check ourselves also.
Hartosh, the issue of, say, Arnab and Amish, I think this is a good one to pick up because, we saw everything done the right way there, right? It was picked up quickly. They consolidated the cases in Amish Devgan's case, even the earlier one against Arnab. With Arnab's case where he was arrested, immediate all those comments about personal liberty, even one day.
Go to jail.
Yeah, but I'm saying the court, when it picked it up.
I feel we must not bypass, because then I think we are also playing with facts.
No, I'm not saying that what the court did was wrong there. And I'm saying what was, the court absolutely did everything right in Arnab's case, is what I'm trying to say. So the question is though, how again now do we in the media have to now, because as Vrinda is saying, right, we can't be in a position where we're saying, oh, for this case, we are going to come out and be like, what, this is a good thing or a bad thing, and we can't. And how do we bring up the fact that, there are journalists for whom this is happening and it's good, and we have to make sure we are celebrating that. But also, be able to point out, is it right to, in those circumstances, also then point out, what, it's good Arnab has got it, but now what about Zubair?
Is it celebrating Arnab, please? It's not celebrating the principle of law.
That the law has worked for them, but like, how do we, how do we celebrate, or how do we raise the issue that, okay, this has happened here, but what about these?
So the question is, let us note that Arnab got relief and that it is good that he got relief, but that same relief should be extended to everybody in the same fashion, which is what we are saying. Beyond that, the fact remains, the point you've raised, we are all aware of it, and actually, strangely enough, which is what I tell most of my fellow journalists, that please don't go around pretending to a fear that should not exist. This government is targeting on identity and ideology. If you look at the kind of arrests that have been made over a period of time, either you are identified strongly with Marxist thought, or you're Muslim, or you're both, and if you're both, God help you. Omar Khalid, that there should be even a case against Omar Khalid is a travesty. It doesn't matter which court, what they say, it doesn't really matter. The truth is that the rest of us, sitting in Delhi, for us to think we are specially threatened for any reason, actually, at the moment, is a huge mistake. We should exercise that freedom to the extent we can, and that is actually the truth right now, basically.
And I think that really covers that point really well. And I think the question then is, again, and this comes back to what we were talking about earlier, language. What is the ways in which, so we have to be stronger, right? That when we shouldn't just use the trappings of independent journalism and being impartial to not call, it's that thing that someone's saying it's raining outside, someone's saying it's not. We have to stick our head out the window. So that's also on us and those of us who have that privilege right now. Do we have time for one last question? Okay, we have time for one last question. Okay, Anisha.
Hi. I'm Anisha. I'm a reporter myself. So I'm sort of expanding on what Vakasha just said and asking you, Vrinda and Hartosh, as people who've been in this field for a much longer time. You guys, you've been talking about how times are changing, conversations are changing, and how we as journalists need to continue that fight, so need to continue being independent. So my question to you, as somebody who's much junior to you in this field, in law and in journalism, what exactly do we do in this situation where speaking out is, well, I mean, if you're working independently, there is a state that could come after you. If you're working with some media organization, then the state would come after your job. In that situation, and speaking purely as somebody in this particular line of work, what advice do you have for the rest of us who are following in this field and much behind you in your footsteps?
You know what Oscar Wilde said about giving good advice, right? And don't follow in our footsteps. I mean, those are two cautionary warnings I would give you, freely. I hear what you are saying, Anisha, and I know what you mean. It's a very difficult space, and yes, we need to do our jobs, and yes, people need to earn money and they run their homes, and people need to hold on to their jobs. So none of us are living in Gaga land that let's all do whatever we want and bring out our own little portals and journals. I'm not suggesting that at all. I think it's, to go back to the question of language, I think it's interesting how we use the language today. There are multiple ways in which we can actually express ourselves. And being a lawyer, that's what I meant when I said it's a challenging but exciting time. I feel that we also need to be, and it helps both in communication, because if you're going to speak in a certain tone, you're already shutting out many, many people. And I don't want to shut out anyone from at least listening to what I'm saying. They may disagree, that's entirely their prerogative. But how do you communicate? How do you write it? What are the words you use? I think that helps a lot in nobody being able to, and as a lawyer, we are trained not to use language of a certain kind, and to ensure that the language states what we are saying without it being shrill, without anybody saying, oh, how did you say this, how did you use that? In fact, what's interesting is that those representing the state are actually repeatedly using language that cannot be used in a courtroom, or should not be used, or at least is unprecedented as having been used in the courtroom. So I think there is that space. And it is about, I really think this battle is about a contestation of ideas about this country. It's going to go through a certain phase, but people are going to, there will be people who are going back and forth from that fence. I know that there is a team, I agree. That team is large. But is it a static team? Aren't there others who are still trying to figure out what is happening, what we are thinking? I mean, so there is a fluidity in the democracy, which at least I'm not giving up on. And I think as journalists, as lawyers, we need to hone our skills of communication, both so that we are understood well, and because nobody catches you out.
If I may, and it's only a mild reprimand on the language you used, that we must not exaggerate the nature of the problem we are facing. Most journalists are not under threat of losing their job. The government is not coming after most journalists. Most journalists should exercise at least the limits of what they are allowed to do where they are. Unfortunately, that is not happening. And I understand that the limits are different in the Times of India. The limits are different in the Indian Express. The limits are different in, say, if we claim credit for ourselves, in the Caravan. The salaries are different also, and you must understand that as well, yeah? But given those constraints, you have to find your places and find ways of expressing yourself. And almost all journalists in all three of these places are not under threat from the government, yeah? And we must keep that in mind.
So I think that's pretty much it. Sorry again to everyone for keeping you longer and away from the high tea. Thank you so much, Vrinda and Hartosh. That was an incredible session. There's so much, I think, which we have to all keep thinking about. And please go for high tea now. let's not keep anyone here.
Vote of thanks is to be done. So sit down for 2 more minutes. Thank you. Thank you very much. I have an important appeal to make. One is Internet Freedom Foundation and Newslaundry are primarily funded by people like you. So go onto our website. And we've done enough complaining for a long time. So put your money where your mouth is, support the Internet Freedom Foundation, support Newslaundry, and support the Caravan. They also take subscriptions, because like we say, when the public pays, the public is served. When advertisers pay, advertisers are served. So do what you can, and journalists will push the limits. I will just quote George Carlin, a famous stand-up comic. He had said, the cliche often used that don't cross the line. He says it's the duty of the comedian to find out where the line is drawn and cross it deliberately. I think it is also the duty of journalists to do that. Spread the sandpit in which others can perform. So we have to keep pushing that line. So I would just like to thank everybody who participated. The panel, thank you. That was extremely interesting and informative. And thank you for moderating that. Thank you all of you who attended. Thank you all our panelists. And especially thank you Bharucha and Kaushik, Bharucha and partners. They supported us, as did Saket Shukla, our lawyer. When we discussed this, Apar and I, we thought, let's see whether we can get a conversation going about FoE Con, which we call law, media and state, although the middle word Hartosh has a problem with. I'll just discuss what we can replace it with. And we said, let's see what kind of interest there is to this. And we were blown away by the kind of interest that there was. So we want to make this a bigger and bigger conference every year. So I would love your feedback, and if you could give that to us, because the entire team of Internet Freedom Foundation, all the volunteers, all of them at the back, including the team of Newslaundry, have worked pretty hard to put this together in a very short period of time. It's just a on a whim idea that, we all had that, is this possible? So we are planning to make this more ambitious and bigger. So your feedback would be very, very valuable. And I'll just tell you where you can give that feedback. You can mail support, that's SUPPORT, support at FoE-con.in. So that's support at FoE-con.in. And you can also tweet us your feedback at FoE_con. So do let us know what you would like us to talk about. What are the kind of panelists you think would add value to the kind of conversations we want to have? Because to keep democracy robust and alive, the law, lawyers, and news journalists have to form an extremely valuable alliance so that we can continue to perform all the other whims that we do in a democracy that allows that to happen. So thank you all, thank you, and thank you to all the people who did support us. Have a great day.